Basically in this semester, mm, we are supposed to study a few part of modernist architecture and then postmodernism in architecture. So before we discuss about postmodern architecture as a style of architecture, let's see some history behind it, right? So what is the history of building design and what is the history of settlement design or city design in the history of architecture?
Yes, sir.
Okay. See, when we study history, we always talk about only the famous things, right? We only talk about the Pantheon. We only talk about the Parthenon. We only talk about Taj Mahal as a part of Mughal architecture. But it is always we need to consider as an architect or as a part of the history of architecture course. We should always consider the humans, the people, the culture they represent, the language, how people used to live, how people were living in that particular age. So all these things need to be considered when we study history. It is not just about the buildings. We in the history course, we only study about buildings. We only talk about the elements of that particular building. We only talk about the components, the style it stands for. But we many times we don't talk about or we don't address those people who represent that particular time frame. So it is always need to consider. I mean, see, do you think that you represent this contemporary time? Yes, most of you agree that you all belong to this contemporary age. But when after 50 years or after 100 years, after 70 years from now, somebody will write history, do you think any historians will write your name in that history book? No, nobody will write your name in that particular history book because unless you do something different, unless you do something which attracts the other side, then nobody will write your name. So it is also the responsibility of the historians who write a book on history and also the responsibility of the designer or the architect or all those stakeholders who uh, take part in this profession, that we need to address people, we need to address the indigenous people, we need to address the indigenous culture of this of any particular region when we talk about the history of that particular part or particular region.
Yes, sir.
Okay, see, Sani, how many of you think that history is a very boring subject? History cannot be interesting.
Sir, I think history is interesting.
Why do you think history is interesting?
So because, because we need to figure it out that from what the planning is involved behind the famous
Hmm.
building and so
Okay.
need we get to know about those structures.
Okay.
Sir,
Correct.
actually,
Hmm.
I find it very interesting because it's not just about the structure, but also why the structures were created and what was the purpose. Like, was it to
Hmm.
show hierarchy or some other purposes? So that is
Hmm.
also quite interesting.
Okay. Any more comments? Burden, do you find history interesting?
Yes, sir.
Why?
Sir, because we come to know if in history or in past somebody have made some mistakes, so we can learn from those mistakes and try that not to repeat them.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. See, unless you know what have been built in your past, you cannot create something different. Right. I mean, it is very similar to. I'll give you an example. If I draw a triangle and tell others that this is my invention and I created this triangle, so what will happen? Everyone will laugh at me because I don't know the history. The triangle was created or invented 100 years, thousands years back. So the same way, if you don't know what had happened in your past, so how could you create something different? So if you create the Parthenon or the Pantheon and you claim that I have created something different or I have designed something different, so everyone will laugh at you, right? the same way. So it is very important to learn your history, to learn your past before you proceed towards your future. This is a basic presentation of introduction of history. So I'll not get into the details of postmodernism today. So I'll give you a small revision of the history that we have already crossed. So starting from the prehistoric part, so in the prehistoric section we have three parts, right? Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic. So if you see the characteristics of that Paleolithic age, so that was the old Stone Age. So it was around, until 10,000 BC. It was until 10,000 BC. So what people were doing during that particular period? So people were hunting, people were gathering, and they were nomadic in nature. When they had to move around here and there, they were not properly civilized and they were not settled in a particular place. So they had to go here and there to collect food and to get shelter. So these are the features of that Paleolithic age where people were hunting to get food. They were not able to do cultivation to prepare to manufacture food. So if you move on to the next phase of time, prehistoric time, that is Mesolithic age, which is the Middle Stone Age. So if you see the characteristic of the features of this age, so people were still hunting, people were still gathering and fishing to collect food, and they were still nomadic. They were still moving around here and there without settling in a particular place. And but they started domestication of dogs. They find the dogs very friendly in nature. They find it very easy to handle the dogs. So they started domestication of dogs. That means not only dogs, few other animals were also started to get domesticated by the people of that particular age. Then next period of that prehistoric stage, that's the Neolithic age, where people started to do agricultural activities. Then they started to get civilized. They settle in a particular place, uh, and they stop moving here and there to collect food and to get shelter. So domestication of livestock, cattle, sows, sheep, goats, pigs. So they started settling down in a place and they started the domestication of livestock. So this is the prehistoric type of humans. So at this time, if you see, they in the first two phases, they people were nomadic people. So they don't have any particular shelter type of things. So they don't have proper structures. So architectural history is still missing in that particular period. But in the Neolithic age, they have small amount of architectural touch into their civilization because they started to get civilized or settled. So this is an image of a prehistoric city or prehistoric town. This is also a pictorial representation of a prehistoric town where people started to get civilized. People started to settle down in a particular place on the bank of the rivers. Now see, move on to the next phase, that is the ancient architecture. So from 2600 BC to 300 AD, this phase of time is called ancient architecture. So before the ancient architecture, we have prehistoric time, and prehistoric times. During the prehistoric time, we have less evidence of any architectural footprints. We have some examples, like if you see the example of Bhimbetka in Madhya Pradesh, Bhopal. So there you could see stone stone paintings, some evidences of those Neolithic phases. So these some examples are still there. Then we get this time phase, that is 2600 BC to 300 AD, which is the ancient architecture period. Here we have lot of examples of architectural footprint, like this example, these two pictures. Do you know how from where these two pictures are? Hello?
So maybe Egypt.
Egypt. Any more idea?
So
So
Mohenjo-daro and
Mohenjo-daro. So Mohenjo-daro.
Harappa,
Okay, okay.
Mohenjo-daro, sir.
Okay. See. So this is from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, the Indus Valley civilization, right? So Indus Valley civilization started with the present history that is existing or we have as a document. According to those historians and those documents, we normally date it back to 2600 BC to 300 AD, according to our textbooks. But if you see the recent invention related to Indus Valley civilization, it dated back to 5000 BC to 2000 BC to 5000 BC. Now in 2014 also a few site related to Indus Valley civilization were excavated and they were recognized in a very in a global way. You know which one is the largest site of Indus Valley civilization? Any idea?
So
No idea. See,
Sir,
the
can you repeat?
which one is the largest site in Indus Valley civilization?
Sir, Rakhi Garhi?
Okay, good, great. Google किया?
No, sir.
Okay, where it is?
सर हरप्पन डिस्ट्रिक्ट मतलब उस हिसार डिस्ट्रिक्ट में है शायद
अच्छा, हिसार डिस्ट्रिक्ट हरियाणा में है, कुरुक्षेत्र
Yes,
के
sir.
आसपास. Okay,
Yes.
so Rakhigari was excavated and invented in the year 2014, and it was recognized in 2014 that Rakhigari is the largest Indus Valley civilization site that we have. So ancient architecture within this time frame only 2600 BC to 300 AD, we have examples of this pyramids, Pantheon, Parthenon. Then what is this?
Sanchi Stupa, sir.
Sanchi Stupa.
Okay, this is Sanchi Stupa. Then we have all these Ajanta Ellora caves. So these architectural footprints belongs to this ancient architectural phase of architectural history. Then medieval architecture starts from 400 AD to 1400 AD. We have examples of Romanesque architecture, Gothic architecture, Byzantine architecture. So all these type of style of architecture belongs to this age, medieval architecture. So what we have seen that the prehistoric humans, where we have three different period of time. One is Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic. Next we have the ancient architecture, then medieval architecture, and then all these different architectural movement starting from 1400 AD to 1900 AD, Renaissance, Baroque architecture, Rococo, Neoclassical, Art Nouveau, then Art Deco. So all these different styles of architecture exist. Because why I'm repeating the same thing, I mean that you have already studied, I hope, because see, unless you connect those links, unless you understand why people have evolved so much and why, what was the region of that evolution, that need to be properly addressed when before we talk about postmodern architecture or modern architecture, right? So all these different phases of time need to be learned properly. Without learning the characteristic features of these time frames or these time phases, it would be very incomplete to study postmodern architecture. So and can anyone tell me what were some basic features of that Renaissance period? Baroque period, any idea? Rococo, Neoclassical?
So Renaissance had simplicity and geometry. Ornamentation was plain, like no, it's not very high ornamentation.
Okay. Then फिर बारूक में क्या क्या है?
Sir, it was highly decorative and ornamented style of architecture.
Hmm.
And sir, I'm not sure, but I think fresco paintings were also done.
Hmm.
during that.
और क्या क्या फीचर्स हैं? और बाकी स्टूडेंट्स बताओ. न्यू क्लासिकल, आर्ट नोवो, आर्ट डेको, ये सब के बारे में कुछ आइडिया?
So they started using more of columns and domes and more of geometric shapes.
ओके. और क्या क्या है? So if you normally see all these styles starting from this Renaissance to Art Deco, so all these architectural styles have a lot of decorations, curving, distortion of shapes, then concave and convex forms, then repetition of different architectural elements, repetition of columns, repetition of windows, repetition of curves, flowers, sculptures, symmetricity, then dramatic use of columns, pediments, those triangular pediments, dome roofs, then grand scale of buildings were very high, very huge in scale during these periods. Then lines, curves. So all these features need to be properly understood before we get into the modern or postmodern architecture. So please study these period also and the features of these styles. So what are the features of Baroque architecture? What are the features of Rococo architecture? What are the features of neoclassical architecture? What are the features of Neo Art Nouveau? So just have a look on these type of architecture before we study history of architecture for the postmodernism. Then after 1900, from 1900 to 1960, we normally talk about different modern architectural styles during this period. And from 1960 to 2000, we normally say that this period of architectural style belongs to the postmodern style of architecture. So see, though we say normally that 1900 to 1960 that represents the modern style of architectural style, but we need to understand different geographically all these regions. This particular time period doesn't get fixed in all the regions of the planet, because if you see the history of India, we got independence in 1947. So maybe modern architecture started after 1947 or a few years back, from 1947, I mean 1930, 1935. So it will vary, right? From in India, the time period will be a little different. In Italy, the time period will be a little different. In London, in England, the time period will be a little different. So do we fix it, that time frame, the 1900 to 1960, but still don't fix it yourself that the buildings which were designed during this phase, those buildings only belong to modern architecture, or the buildings which were designed after 1960, between 1960 to 2000, those buildings represents the style of postmodern architecture. It doesn't happen like this. I mean, you'll get a lot of examples where you'll get to see that particular building was designed in the year 1970, but that particular building represents the modern architectural style. And you'll also get some buildings which were designed before 1950, but those buildings actually represents the postmodern architectural style of architecture. So these things will happen. So never fix your mind that I'll get a building which is designed in 1950, that particular building was designed in modern architecture style. It's not like this. So time period will vary, but broadly we categorize these two terms, modern architecture and postmodern architecture, within this two time frame. One is 1900 to 1960, and the next one is 1960 to 2000. So if you see the timeline, so prehistoric, then we have ancient architecture around 2600 BC to 300 BC. Then medieval architecture 400 AD to 1400 AD. Then all these art movements and movements of architecture, and Baroque, Rococo 1400 to 1900. Then broadly we say modern architecture from 1900 to 1960, and postmodern architecture to 1960 up to 2000. And then we also talk about contemporary style of architecture. So what is this word, contemporary style of architecture? Any idea?
So maybe I'm not sure, but maybe it's a combination of modern and postmodern.
Okay. Or koi comment?
So the style of architecture that is going on in present day.
Okay. So see, the style of architecture which is existing now, which is going on the present time, that is the basic definition of contemporary architecture. Now see, if you see the definition of contemporary architecture, that is also very interesting. I mean, if you talk about the contemporary architecture, architectural style of 1900, so that particular style of architecture which was there in 1900, that is a contemporary architecture for the people of 1900. And when you talk about the contemporary architectural style of 2600 BC, so the styles which was there in the 2000 in this time frame 2600 BC, so that was the contemporary architecture for that group of people who were living there. Okay, so it is always respect to time. Contemporary architecture or contemporary style of architecture, it is always respect to related to time. I mean, now when we talk about contemporary architecture of now, so it should talk about the architectural styles which are being practiced today, right? How people were nomadic in nature when during the prehistoric time, then they started to get settled, then they started to design buildings, they started to construct building during the ancient architectural period, then they started to make few advanced buildings in medieval architectural style, and then during these Renaissance, Baroque architecture, Rococo, and all these art movement period, people explored new shapes of new way of designing buildings with a lot of decorations, with a lot of design philosophies. Then we have modern architecture, then we have postmodern architecture. And what is the present architecture is called? That is our contemporary architecture of today. Now see, if you see the buildings before the modernism came, all the buildings have their own philosophy of designing buildings. They had a different philosophy. But when the modernist came, they started to think in a different way. They started to design buildings with this philosophy. The form follows function and less is more. So if you see the buildings of Baroque architecture, Gothic architecture, neoclassical architecture, I mean, they don't have any relation with the function. They are just designed the way the designers wanted to design it, but they had a very less relation with the function. They designed the building first, then they put the function. They designed the building first, then they put the function into the building. But when the modernist came, they started to think in a different way. We should follow the function first, and according to the function of that particular building, we should design that particular building. They said ki a museum should look like a museum, a school should look like a school, a hospital should look like a hospital. I mean, they said a hospital should not look like a museum, right? The form should follow the function. The functionality should be properly displayed through the design of the structure. Then then this less is more. This is that you have said this is all about minimalism. Now see, I'll explain it through a sketch. Can you see this class notebook?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, see. Okay, can you see these two diagrams?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Okay, just assume that this is an example of a small space. This is your room. This is another room. So what I have done with the first room, in the first space, I have put two beds or two tables, then one sofa, and maybe one another sofa. And in the next space or next room, what I have done is I have put a table and a chair only. So if okay, so in the first space, what is happening? I have put more furnitures, so I get less space, right?
Yes. Yes.
But in the next room, I have put less furnitures, so I got more space. So the same way, it should according to the function. If it is not required, we should not treat them, right? More furniture, less space, less furniture, more space. So this is how we define less is more, correct? Then we have these let me see all these definitions: Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, Neoclassical, Art Nouveau, Art Deco. Then we also have Cubism. We also have Neoplasticism. See, all these terms, isms, are a kind of movements, art movements, right? It's not like that Renaissance only talks about uh, architectural style, or Rococo only talks about architectural style, or Neoplasticism or Neoclassical talks about only architectural styles. Art Deco or Art Nouveau talks only about architectural styles. It's not like this. It is an overall. It was an overall movement of art. It also that particular during those particular different phases of time, music also got changed, art, painting also got changed, literature also got changed. So if you see a literature of modernism and if you see a literature of baroque architecture, you'll get some difference. Similarly, in the paintings also, if you see some paintings which was done in the modernism era, and which was another painting which was done in the baroque architecture, baroque time period, you'll get to see some difference. So all these characters, all these different philosophies of styles, so those were uh, done during different phases in all the areas: his literature, music, art, architectural style. In all the areas, you will get to see all those features or characters. So in visual arts also, you will see the difference. In a painting which was done in the period of Art Deco, you'll get a different taste, and you'll get a different flavor. And in the painting which is done in during the modern era, you'll get a different flavor, and you'll get a different taste. So when we talk about the painters of modern time period or modernism, they actually tried to depict what was happening during that time frame. They 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 talked about, through their paintings, they talked about the realistic or the real things happening during that time period. They did not romanticize the things. So before this period, before the modernism, whatever paintings you could see, all those paintings, all those literature, all those music, all those paint, everything uh, was done in a very exaggerated way. But if you see paintings of modernism, they were more realistic in nature. So what was happening during that time period? That those happenings were properly the painters were tried to depict through their paintings. Modern architecture, it's the same way. When we see a building, the elements of a building which was designed in Art Deco, so they were very the designers romanticize it. But if you see a building of modernism, they tried to give it a realistic flavor to their buildings. If you see this building, what you could see: linear lines, straight lines, horizontal windows, columns. But if you see a building of Art Deco or neoclassical period, Rococo, so you'll get decorative interiors with all decorations, sculptures, designs, different color palettes, paintings, curves, design like a creature or design like a sculpture, then different shapes, triangular, circular, oval shape, ellipse, all these different forms which were romanticized by the designers of those particular time. Those elements and those features you don't get to see in modern architecture. You get a different taste, you get a different flavor of architecture during modern architecture. So the characteristic features of modern architecture, I hope you have already learned these features in your last semesters. So lack of ornamentation, emphasis of rectangular forms and horizontal and vertical lines, low horizontal massing and flat roofs, emphasis on horizontal plans and broad roof overhangs, use of modern materials and systems, relationship between interior spaces and site, emphasis on open flowing interior spaces, generous use of glass and natural light. So all these features you get to see in the buildings which were designed in the period of modernism. So again, what happened during the period of postmodernism? So we have already crossed a period where a lot of decorations were being done, lot of sculptures were being done through building design. Then we have modernism. And what happened during the modernism? See, all the architects, most of the architects who represents modernism, they used to use straight lines, they used to use horizontal windows, they used to use these type of columns. I mean, everything was flat roof, you know. So all the buildings which were designed in the period of modern era, they look more similar in nature. I mean, there was no difference between a building design in India and the building design in London, because they were following the same pattern, right? The horizontal lines, linearity, windows, horizontal windows, straight lines, flat roofs. So all the elements were similar in nature during that particular time frame. So people got bored, right? So then people started to think in a different way. Then again, they said, the people of postmodern architectural style, they said we should take some reference from our history. We should talk about the culture of one particular region. I mean, if I design a building in Jaipur, it should talk about the culture of Jaipur, it should talk about the language of Jaipur, it should talk about the characters of Jaipur, it should talk about the philosophy of Jaipur. And again, when we design a building in London, it should talk about the philosophy of, I mean, the culture of London, it should talk about the people of London, it should talk about the language of London. So this is how postmodernism came into picture. Decorations gone. Then we have modernism. During modernism, we have got similar type of buildings with similar features, lack of ornamentation, horizontal lines, windows. I mean, everything was similar. So there was no difference between a building design in Varanasi and a building design in London. So people started to think in a different way again. They started to say, no, we will design according to the culture of a particular region. We will design according to the background, the historical background it represents, a particular region represents. So this is how postmodernism came. So the reasons why postmodernism took over from modernism, somewhere people got bored of the form follows function motto. Then the international style thought it promoted transparency and bold lines. It left out the innate characteristic of people, which was to incorporate embellishment onto their facades. The need for detailing. The less is more doctrine led to monotony in building construction and design, because everything was less is more, less is more, less is more. So you'll get a monotony in building design. You'll get similar type of buildings in different parts of the planet. Then modernism led to rapid decline in the city framework, and social values were getting lost. Of course, the social values will get lost because when you don't talk about the historical background, when you don't talk about the cultural background of the particular city, everything will. एक second. So everything will get lost. So these are some architects of this postmodern era. What is this house? Vanna Venturi house. I have already wrote the name. Any idea about this house? Who designed this?
No, sir.
See, this was a famous house designed by Robert Venturi. This house is called Vanna Venturi House, so which was designed by Robert Venturi. So people say that this was the first building designed according to the philosophy of postmodernism. We'll also discuss in details about this building also in our next presentations.